And thank you all for being here. I normally don't need a mic, that's right. That's why I didn't pick one up. Yeah, so as Ravi has suggested, Naushad Forbes is distinctive and unique in the world of Indian entrepreneurship, and also distinctive and unique in the world of Indian scholarship. I don't know entrepreneur who has a PhD from Stanford, and I certainly know scholar with a PhD from anywhere who can run a successful company. It's actually more difficult to be a scholar who's a successful entrepreneur than the other way around, right? So, and along with this twin areas of expertise, he also displays a notable independence of mind. You know, not in a overt, polemical, combative way, which is why I'm seated to the left of him today. But in his own quiet, understated, pointed, precise way, you can see displayed in this wonderful book, the independence of mind. There's also an extraordinarily wide range of reading as well as rich practical experience that he brings to his book, to the research and the writing that underlies this book. Ravi mentioned Stanford. Now, I taught in Stanford many, many years ago, and the smartest undergraduates I've ever taught anywhere in my life, actually, from Stanford. I don't normally say it in Sudhata's University, Yale, publicly, but I can say it at the Bangalore International Center. But what is interesting about Naushad is that his favorite teacher at Stanford was not someone who taught him engineering or mathematics or physics, but a historian of France called Gordon Wright. And that's kind of the range of his interests and his understanding. Intellectual range, his intellectual range combined with this deep and intense practical experience of running a successful high-tech company, outward-oriented high-tech company, then of course contributing to organizations like the CIA and so on. So it's a real privilege to be in conversation about this book. Now, in keeping with the author's background, the book has a great deal to say about economics and industry. And he kind of starts with economics and industry, and I'm not sure whether he took any courses on Marxism at Stanford, or maybe, but certainly there's an element of Marx's famous scheme of base and superstructure in the way this book is conceived, that economics is the base, and then politics and culture and institutions become the superstructure. But there's careful attention to the superstructure as well. So as you read through this book, as I hope many of you will after our conversation today, you'll see that the author has an impressive grasp of such subjects as culture, design, innovation, and institutions. Such subjects as culture, design, innovations, and institutions, subjects that Indian entrepreneurs do not usually understand or otherwise underplay. And I hope we'll cover many of these themes in our conversation. But as a lapsed Marxist myself, I'd like to start with business and economics. It's also the subject on which I probably understand the least, you know, among all the themes covered in your book. We'll come to, culture and institutions and research as we go on. But let me start with economics and with a plain, practical question. Now, one of the real issues confronting us in India today, which any layperson, even a layperson like me who doesn't follow the stock market or the business news or the GDP numbers or anything else, knows, is that there is an employment crisis. We are not able to employ our men and our women, enough of them productively, efficiently, creatively. And that's something you address in your book. And Ravi mentioned the demographic dividend, which was talked about 10 or 15 years ago. And now, of course, one does not know whether that's a curse or a blessing to have so many unemployed, unemployable young people around. And much of the violence that is generated in society is generally, of all kinds, is generally by men between the ages of 18 and 30. Right, and this is, of course, a global sociological phenomenon, not just restricted to India. And in your book, you identify, with regard to the question of employment generation and with regard to India fulfilling its economic promise, you identify two sectors as crucial to economic renewal: manufacturing and tourism. So I'd love for us to begin with you telling us a little bit about how you think these two sectors could contribute to employment generation and hence to economic growth.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ram. Thank you, Ravi, for the kind introduction. Ram, that was by far the warmest, nicest introduction anyone has given me, forever, I think. So thank you very much. First of all, I'm going to make one quick comment which doesn't have anything to do with your question, Ram, which is when I talk about the promise of India, I think the Bangalore International Center is a great illustration of promise and of fulfilling promise. It's a center that's been created which is beautiful. It's architecturally so attractive. It's entirely funded by private money. It brings together such an intellectually rich set of programs. And really, that's the promise of India. It's not the state stepping in and setting up some kind of a cultural center. There are no subsidies involved in how the center runs. That's the promise of India, I think. And we'll come back to that, I think, later on. So to come to the employment question, anyone who studied economic growth and development points out that one of the key drivers of economic growth over decades as a country develops is the movement of people from lower productivity occupations into higher productivity occupations. Manish will tell you all about this. And this move of people from lower productivity to higher productivity occupations, the sort of archetype is someone employed in marginal agriculture, in farming, usually overemployed in farming, who moves from a rural occupation like farming to a city and is employed in manufacturing. And you get a jump in productivity which can be very substantial. Typically, to take the Indian case at present, I think average manufacturing productivity in India is 20 times average agricultural productivity in India per individual. So if you have someone moving from agriculture to industry, you get this jump of 20 times in manufacturing. Now, if you look at what's been happening in our country, people move to cities in search of employment, and we get a jump in productivity, without question, but we tend not to get it in manufacturing. Because the creation of the most vibrant job market has been in urban areas, but it's been in informal services. So it's construction, it's as the single big category. It's security guards, it's drivers, it's domestic staff, it's tea sellers on the road, it's people working in small restaurants and retail outlets, not large malls, but small shops. And it's all that informal employment that's really been driving the economy forward for many, many years. And you get a jump in productivity, but you don't get a jump of 20 times. You might get a jump of 4 times, 5 times. So very substantial, and it's been the source of our economic growth and our consumption story for the last 30 years. Right? Why manufacturing and tourism? One of the things that I talk about in the book is that one of the things that happens as countries develop is that more and more people get modern. If you're a Marxist,
I used to be a Marxist.
Yeah. So if you're a Marxist, you don't believe in that at all. You argue with modernization theory. You say that's completely wrong. That's a colonial mindset. That's et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's actually a strong case to be made for modernization theory, which is that people learn a set of modern attributes that enable them to operate productively in the modern world. And how do you learn those things? You learn by working to a schedule. You learn by appreciating the power of education, where you learn a new skill, you get educated, you learn a new skill, and as a result of that, you can be more productive. So you start developing a sense of efficiency and efficacy that is essential to being a modern-oriented individual. And how do you learn to be modern? So the friend of mine who I quote in the book, Alex Inkelis, a sociologist, and one of the sort of founders of modernization theory, talks about the role that factories play. And he says the factory is a school of modernity. And it's a school of modernity because of all those things that you learn apart from the job itself. You learn to work to a schedule. You learn to work to a prescribed set of instructions. And by following that prescribed set of instructions, you're more productive and efficient. So it's those kinds of attitudes and attributes that you learn as a part of working in a factory. So that's one of the big benefits of working in a factory, apart from productivity. And the same applies for tourism. And there's a second reason for tourism, but the same applies for tourism, that you learn those same modern attributes. You learn service, you learn how to routinize jobs, how to define a process and follow that process to deliver a certain desired quality. And it's all that stuff that adds up to these modern attitudes. The last comment is actually around the opportunities we have in the country. We have a total workforce in the country of 400 million, roughly. Only 30 million are employed in manufacturing, and that's down from 40 million just before the pandemic. So less than 10% of our workforce is actually employed in manufacturing. It's very small for the kind of society we need as a country. 70 million are employed in retail. That's massive relative to manufacturing. And this is, again, these small little shops, informal employment opportunities, et cetera. Right? We have, in our tourism opportunity in the country, we're country number, 20-something in the world tourism rankings in terms of visitors each year. We have everything that it would take to be country number 1. And if we were country number 1, we could put tens of millions more people to work in our tourism-related industries, in the hospitality industry, in restaurants, in tour guides, if nothing else, in transport, in moving people around when they want to visit places and so on. So the opportunity is massive in tourism. I think it's easy to capture. Yeah. The opportunity is also massive in labor-intensive manufacturing, but we do very poorly there. And if you want, we can talk about that more, but so it's a huge opportunity there.
As a lapsed Marxist who hasn't completely forgotten his Marxism, I might push back on modernization theory a bit. Sure. In terms of, there's a famous essay by the great historian E.P. Thompson called Time, Work, Discipline, and Industrial Capitalism, which talks about how you make people work to a clock, you dehumanize them, you individualize them, you separate them from their fellow human beings, you alienate them from the machine, and so on. So, but I won't go down that route for the moment if we have time.
There's also a great movie by Charlie Chaplin called Modern Times.
Precisely.
The first 15 minutes.
Precisely,
right?
precisely,
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
But I want to talk, but that can be, I don't want to get into an arcane Marxism versus modernization theory debate. But about tourism, I want to say something, and then I'll ask you a question. I want to make a comment about my own on tourism, and then I want to ask you a specific question about manufacturing and tourism taken together. The comment about tourism from my experience, I have traveled to every state in India extensively many times, and often in bus and train, and even walking, not through other means. And what is striking, Naushad, is that 2 states are successful in tourism, Rajasthan and Kerala. But actually, if you look at ecological diversity, cultural diversity, architecture, literature, music, dance, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, Orissa, in all these attributes comfortably equal or possibly even exceed Rajasthan and Kerala. I could elaborate on this, but as someone who knows all these states, I can certainly say I find them in many ways more interesting, more appealing, more diverse than either Rajasthan or Kerala, which are interesting and diverse and appealing enough. But so I think that's something which is just an observation. A second observation is, of course, apart from all the things you need in tourism, you also need openness, and we'll come to culture later, culture, pluralism, tolerance, that people don't tell you what you should eat, what you should wear. And if these are the images, kind of going around everywhere, then there's an issue. But the question I want to ask you, Naushad, is Ravi mentioned the government as enabler. What should the government be doing to enable more employment generation, more efficient, productive employment generation in manufacturing and tourism?
So, first of all, we should look to the government not to create jobs itself, but to indeed enable the creation of jobs. So, what would enable the creation of jobs? In manufacturing, it does require labor reform. And what's been done 2 years ago when these laws, these 44 laws were collapsed into 4 laws, is actually a big step in the right direction. But it's a step in the right direction. There's more still to be done. I understand where people are coming from in terms of saying, look, you need to protect labor, look at what's happening in Bangladesh. And my answer is yes, if you're in one of those manufacturing jobs, yes, you can say you want those benefits. But if somehow it limits the creation of millions of manufacturing jobs, then you're actually depriving people of that option, and I think people should have that option. So the fact that the garment industry in Bangladesh, not a great place to work, but if you ask me, it's a lot better place to work than marginal farming in India and marginal farming in Bangladesh too.
Yeah.
So I think our marginal farmers in India should have the same option of moving into jobs, however poor quality, in modern manufacturing and by the million. And that might mean that we have to tolerate for a period of time a labor situation that is not all that we would like, and that's not perfect. And you accept it for a period of time, and you get on with it, and you keep trying to improve it, and you keep trying to make them safer and better quality and so on, but you enable them to happen.
Yeah. And with tourism, what would be the government
So
reforms?
for tourism, actually, I think the government's role there is number one, infrastructure, right? Number two, so infrastructure at various levels. So connectivity, so air connectivity, rail connectivity, road connectivity. Free, one of the things that we have an abundance of in the country is entrepreneurs. And I'm not talking about Chris. I'm talking about someone who will run a small taxi company with 4 taxis. And we have an abundance of that, and enable them to actually transport people in an efficient way. Don't come in the way and say that, listen, only the state transport has a monopoly over running buses and bus services, etc. Let private companies compete in all of these areas following a certain set of safety regulations, and then beyond that, let them operate. Because if you do that kind of thing, you can open things up to a much greater extent. So there's that infrastructure piece. There's the laws associated with the use of land to set up small hotels, not the Taj, but set up small hotels around various cities. And we have to start shedding some of our sort of mindset attitudes. For example, when you talk to people from our tourism industry, they will say, we don't want the mass tourism that goes to the south of France or the south of Portugal and so on. But or Thailand, right?
Yeah.
But that's what creates millions of jobs. It's not a few thousand highly affluent people who go around and stay at the Taj and the Oberoi.
Right.
It's people who will come and stay in budget hotels and see India by the million. And I think that's what we should enable on a widespread basis. Last comment on what I think the government should do. It does need to address all those softer points. Yeah. We have huge cultural attributes that make us attractive as a place for people to come. Yeah. Huge variety of food and dress and dance and culture and everything else. Yeah. Let people experience it. Yeah. Don't place limits on what they can experience.
Yeah, we'll come back to the culture question later in our conversation. But staying with economics, Naushad, early on in the book, you talk about what the 1991 reforms meant to you and your brother. And you clearly saw it in my view, largely rightly, as a departure from the state socialism of the Nehru in the Indira era. And, but reading some of your remarks about where we are today, I wondered, while obviously much less enamored of state socialism than the Nehru government, or the Indira, and certainly the Indira government, the current government is much less enamored. He's sold Air India and maybe doing other things. Does it nonetheless promote a throwback to an outdated idea of self-reliance? At several places in the book, you kind of suggest that. And I was also intrigued by your demarcation of what you consider the best years of Indian economic growth, 1991, which is no one would dispute where you start, but then you end in 2017, which is, well, several years before COVID. But, I know that, to your credit, you have spoken out, as I said, in your non-polemical way about things like the RCEP and so on. So is there this sense of, as I said, is there a kind of, and even if you look at some of the rhetoric in what's happening in the Ukraine war today, Narendra Modi's foreign minister almost sounds like Jawaharlal Nehru's Krishna Menon, at times, right? So I wondered, but leave the foreign policy apart, on economic policy, on the question of openness to technology, ways to enhance productivity, incomes, would you say that the government needs to loosen up?
So if you look at, I do have this 1991 to 2017 period, and I say that every year from 1991 to 2017 we were in better shape as a country. Yeah? Post 2017, I worry that we've regressed, and we've regressed on the economic side, particularly by a turn inward, where we started raising tariffs. We've raised tariffs on over 3,000 items. About half of all our imports have been affected by these increases in tariffs. We've started speaking about FTAs, free trade agreements, as uniformly bad things that India had entered into, and that we really sort of gave away Indian industry and gave away our rights and so on. And this very sharp turn inward, I think, is damaging in the long run. It's damaging, a tax on imports, an economist would tell you that a tax on imports is a tax on exports. And you have this mental attitude that we're all for exports, but we're not for imports. You can't have it that way. If you limit imports, you will end up limiting exports. And you can't have one at the expense of the other. Both will grow together. That's what happened from 1991 to 2017. Our imports grew massively, so did our exports. We had extremely rapid growth in foreign trade on all accounts. Since 2017, we've seen that turnaround. So that's one big thing. That's one big thing. There's a second thing. The second thing is that starting again in 2017, I think there was a move to provide, it was a bumpy road from 91 to 2017, not smooth by any means, but there was a general thrust of reducing bureaucratic discretion and reducing the power of individual bureaucrats. 2017 onwards, things seem to have turned around, and the bureaucrats have greater discretion in different areas. Finance ministry officials at lower levels can mount raids than earlier. They have the discretion, Manish will tell you, to prosecute a bunch of different offenses at much lower levels without going to a more senior person in the government and getting a sanction from the secretary or whatever. And that's bad, because that move to actually, it's the opposite of what enables. Yeah. So to come back to Ravi's introductory word, which is exactly the right word, it's the opposite of what enables.
Can I, if I may be allowed to add a personal anecdote which seeks to confirm your cutoff date of 2017? I first went abroad in the late 80s, and I would post books back, or I would order books on courier, and they would always come. After 2017, custom holds up every book of mine, a single book written which I've ordered, and especially complimentary copies of my own books. And it takes me 35 letters, 18 phone calls, and finally finding someone who knows someone who knows someone knows a custom officer who reads, to whom I can present a complimentary copy of my book to get the other 29 released. All right. So there is an issue, and there is an issue. You know, I understand that some regimes see books as bombs, but it's not just about books. I think there is that kind of discussion you find all around. Anyway, so move on. We have so much to cover, and your book ranges so wide. Yeah. Sorry.
There is, unfortunately, I think there is a mindset that the government knows best, and it doesn't.
Absolutely. That was. I remember the brilliant essay you wrote in the volume edited by Anne Kruger and somebody else on what.
That was in 2000.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. So I now want to come to the issue of R&D. You are a PhD in industrial engineering from Stanford. You're deeply committed to research. As you can, Naushad, by the way, for many years taught a course at Stanford, and you can see that he has all the skills of a great teacher. I want to come to this question of research and innovation and how to foster it. There's a striking set of statistics in your book, table 5.5, page 130. And here are the statistics. India invests 0.7% of GDP in research and development, 0.7%. China invests 2.2%. South Korea invests 4.8%. That's the first set of statistics. The second set of statistics on R&D. In India, the share of industry in R&D is 37%. In China, 77%. In South Korea, 80%. So industry is utterly laggard when it comes to investing in R&D. Right. Now I come from a family of scientists. And I agree with a lot of what you say in your book about the state's wrong priorities in the sector. I'm not only from a family of scientists, I'm totally a product of the Indian public university system. All my degrees are here, my BA, my MA, my PhD, right. Now, you have some very interesting, concrete, practical suggestions about what to do with public education. For example, one of your suggestions, which I totally endorse, is that the IITs, the IIMs, and the law schools should become full-service universities. Right. So you're very good on that. You're also right in criticizing Nehru for focusing industrial research in the CSIR labs rather than letting them flourish in the universities, which is the way the Americans went, and which is really the most productive and creative and innovative way to go. So I'm with your criticisms of what the state has done or not done. But why the hell does Indian industry invest so little in R&D? I mean, why is, I think there is a cultural problem here. It's not, and there is a long time ago, again, if I may offer a personal anecdote, a young scholar plagiarized some of my stuff. And I was very upset about it. And the first person I talked to, I think Sujata was out of town, was a friend of mine who works in the Bombay film industry. And she told me, she said, Ram, in the film industry, it is said, in India, the definition of copyright is the right to copy. Now, maybe it extends much more widely than the film industry, right? So I'd like you to answer that question. You may not be guilty personally, but your colleagues and your peers in Indian industry are guilty. Why does Indian industry invest so little in R&D?
So it's a question that I've wrestled with for a while, because actually prompted by a discussion with Rakesh Mohan some years ago, who said that, listen, the thrust of reforms post-1991 were aimed at industry. And he said, why has industry not performed better? And if you combine that with your question on why do we invest so little in R&D, it's actually, if we do invest more, it's actually the answer to the manufacturing, the industry question also. Now, why do we invest as little as we do in R&D? You could argue that our firms are smaller. And because they're smaller, we invest less, etc. And, may have been true once. It's not true today. In industry after industry today, We have firms that are world scale in the chemical industry, in the IT industry, in the engineering industry, in many sectors, in the pharmaceutical industry. Our firms are world scale. Are we not profitable enough? Not true. Our firms, in terms of actual profitability levels, our firms are as profitable, if not more profitable, sector by sector. Take the auto and auto component sectors. Our firms are now increasingly world scale in size, a bit smaller, but getting there, and are as profitable as world industry again in the sector. So it's none of these reasons, because I tried to look at all of these pieces. I think it's actually based on talking to many of my fellow industrialists. I think it's because we think we're actually investing a fair amount in R&D already, and we're not. So the only way in which I can figure out how to get the point across is by getting industrialists to do a benchmarking analysis for their own firm vis-a-vis their industry and say that, listen, take the top 10 or 20 firms in your industry worldwide and start answering a bunch of questions. Start by saying, what's the percentage of sales that you invest in in-house R&D versus what the top 10 or 20 do? That number is publicly available for any publicly listed company. You can get it. And compare those numbers. And if you compare those numbers, you find in the pharmaceutical industry, which is our most R&D intensive industry, we invest about half as a percentage of sales, 8% or so, relative to the international level, which is around 16%. In the auto industry, we invest around 2 to 3% of sales versus about 4 to 5%, which is the world average. In the IT services industry, we invest 1% of sales. That's a much more confusing thing because if you compare it with product companies, the number is very high in terms of R&D intensity. If you compare it with IT services businesses worldwide, and you compare it with IT services business in China, they invest about 8% of sales. So you have big gaps as a percentage of sales. But if you go around and talk to industrialists, they think they invest a lot in R&D. And so I think it's only when they do this benchmarking that they start identifying what some of the gaps are. And then I ask them, I say, listen, how many R&D engineers do you have or scientists in your company? Vis-a-vis, you won't get the data for all top 10 or 20. You don't need to worry about them. Get it for 2 firms. And how many people do you have? How qualified are they? How advanced are those qualifications? What kind of experience do they have? And then what outcomes do you have from R&D? How many new products do you come out with each year, or new services do you come out with each year? How does that compare with the top 10 or 20 firms? That's publicly available information. Everyone keeps talking about it. So you do that benchmarking exercise, and I think people start appreciating the gap. So that's sort of where I am with this. I mean, I think it's a play of changing mindsets.
And you're hopeful you can change some of the mindsets?
Keep talking about it. I think we're making some headway. I think there are some firms that have realized this. And you know, the great thing is, I mean, I talk about this in the book, is that we have the opportunity in the country of a huge abundance, at least of raw talent, which no one else has. So I was talking to a friend who makes air conditions in the air conditioning business, and they were trying to get technology for the control systems, which they used to otherwise import from China. And as part of the PLI scheme, they've now making these controls in the country, and they wanted to set up an R&D facility for it. And first they tried to buy the technology, couldn't. Finally set up their own team. They hired 30 people in 2 months, and then posted 2 of them in Japan to sort of plug into air conditioning manufacturers in Japan to keep track of what they were working on and doing. And then they have these 30 people working here. In very few other countries in the world, would you be able to assemble a 30-person R&D team in 2 months? And in India, we can. So we have this availability of talent. We have this huge potential capability which we are not using. And it's time we did. I mean, it's a huge opportunity. And if we do that, then we'll finally also solve our manufacturing problem. We'll answer Rakesh Mohan's industry question. Because We've had this aspiration of raising manufacturing share in GDP from 15 to 25%. Current government for 8 years, previous government for I don't know how many years before that, it stayed at 15, 16% for the last 30 years. The only way that will start to change is if we see greater investments in R&D.
So you also have a very interesting chapter on design, but I think in the interest of time, I'll leave that for the moment. We might come back on that. I mean, it's a fascinating chapter on design, which is again something Naushad understands, and most Indian industrialists, would not certainly devote a chapter to the subject. But I want to move beyond industry, technology, R&D, to your broader reflections on our culture. And I want to start with our institutions. And you're very perceptive on our institutions, and some of that may come from the kinds of people you studied at Stanford. Some of that may come from your...
And talking to you.
Well, not talking, your own curiosity and your own interest and so on. And I want to read a paragraph from your book on institutions, and where you lay out the domains, so to say, and then ask you to just expand on what you say in the paragraph. So here is a paragraph from Naushad's introduction to the book about institutions, and later on in a specific set of chapters on institutions, he elaborates on it. So I'd like him to speak to that, but let me read out this brilliant executive summary of why Indian institutions are a large part of our problem. So, how do noisy democracies progress? By checks and balances from autonomous and independent institutions such as universities, election commissions, courts, a free media, and effective opposition, and a federal structure where power is shared with the states. I'd like to repeat that. How do noisy democracies progress? By checks and balances from autonomous and independent institutions such as universities, election commissions, courts, a free media, and effective opposition, and a federal structure where power is shared with the states. Instead of a strong leader determining what's right, independent institutions should frame the rules. And these rules are built on a foundation of distinctive and balanced values. Our leaders must be able to listen, tolerate, include, compromise, and balance as much or even more as they are strong, decisive, visionary, and courageous. Leaders who wish to leave a permanent positive legacy on vibrant democracies must set aside things that divide and make people fearful and focus on things that unify and inspire. So while economic leadership is essential, it is not sufficient. We need those independent institutions that balance incentives with protection, economic freedom with social responsibility. And underlying it all are cultural attributes of openness, generosity, and tolerance. It is absolutely brilliant. Pratap Bhanu Mehta would be proud of what you've written. So am I. So am I, by the way. So please expand a little more on this.
So, okay, thank you, Ram, for that reading. So, there is this, we all are impatient for progress. And when we're impatient for progress, I think we seek quick answers. And one of the ways in which we seek quick answers is by wanting decisive moves, do something. And it's always seemed to me that it's more important to do the right thing than to do something fast. Because if you do something really fast, you might end up doing the wrong thing. And instead, if you deliberate, if you listen, if you throw an idea out there and encourage all your colleagues around you to shoot it down, and even if you don't encourage them, they feel that they are empowered enough to be able to shoot it down, then you end up making a better call, a better decision, even if it takes you longer. So that's how I believe we can actually progress as a country. It's not by any individual deciding that this is the right thing for us to do, but that collectively all of our institutions, and institutions are both those formal institutional mechanisms like ECI or courts or higher education. And there are also rules, laws under which we operate, and there are also norms and practices. All of that is part of the institutional fabric of a country. And I think it's that ultimately that can determine how effectively a noisy democracy like ours can progress. And we are a noisy democracy. I mean, watch television. And
I am actually, much less pessimistic than you on whether we can have this institutional reform. And let me explain. And I don't want you to comment. But I've been thinking about this for much of my life. My great mentor, the sociologist Andre Bete, who's half French and half Bengali and fully Indian, as I like to say, and there are other people in this room who know him and know his work, used to say that our institutions are malfunctioning. And he's talking not of today, but the 70s and the 80s, because they have become captive to what he called the three building blocks of Indian society. Our public institutions have become captive to family, religion, and caste. These are the three building blocks of Indian society, and individuals matter much less than family, caste, and religion, which is why our institutions have never functioned the way, the open, transparent, efficient, credible way as many other democracies. Now, more recently, to family, caste, and religion, a fourth threat to institutional independence has emerged, and that is the authoritarian leader. But I want to say, and I don't want you to comment on this, but I just want to say so that all of us understand, that authoritarian leaders cause institutional decline. That's true of countries around the world today. It's true of what's happening here. But something that is less noticed in India is that it's not just Narendra Modi who's the problem. Most chief ministers are also authoritarian. Yeah. I made a list, and I hope to write a column on this. Mamata Banerjee, Jagan Reddy, Pinarayi Vijayan, Adityanath, Kejriwal, Gehlot, KCR, Naveen Patnaik, Hemendra Biswa Sarma, and you can add on to that list. So I think they all bend institutions to their will. And I think this is a deep structural problem. And this may also be, Andre Bete talked about family, caste, and religion. But if you think of Ambedkar's prescient warnings about the cult of hero worship, bhakti in politics, and how that damages us, I think this is a real question, and I think this is maybe for a separate discussion, because if you want to briefly comment on it, because I think there is a cult of personality that has pervaded India for a very long time. Nehru was aware of it. He wrote a famous essay in Modern Review in 1937, because he had studied fascism at first hand. It was an essay about himself, written in the third person, as Chanakya, about what happens when a leader becomes famous and popular and thinks that, he knows the answers to everything. So, and of course, Indira Gandhi perhaps didn't read that essay or forgot it. Jawaharlal,
she practiced it.
Narendra Modi certainly hasn't read that essay, but nor have all these chief ministers I'm talking about. So I think this is, added to family, caste, and religion, authoritarian leadership. And it's probably true in some companies too. It's certainly been true in the Indian cricket team, for example, that this kind of, what you're asking for, the willingness to learn, listen, to encourage criticism, it doesn't come easy to Indian males, and sometimes Indian females too, trust in position of power.
So, no, I fully agree. And by the way, I don't think India is unique in this either. If you go around the world and you look at, Viktor Orban in Hungary, if you look at Putin as an obvious fellow, you look at Bolsonaro, you look, there are many examples, largely men, who, but we had, as you say,
Jayalalitha, for example.
And we had Indira Gandhi.
Indira Gandhi,
right? So it's it is this cult of an authoritarian leader does indeed, they sort of say, well, they see institutions as obstructive. It's keeping them from getting on and doing something that they think is the right thing to do. Yeah. But sometimes institutions end up protecting our own leaders from doing stupid things.
Of course, yeah.
And if they actually went along with what the institution decided, it would actually probably deliver the objectives that that leader is chasing much more effectively. How do you handle that? By the way, I'm quite positive about our institutional revival. It's just that it's not a systematic process. It's sort of a random process. I mean, we suddenly rediscover vitality in our institutions.
One thesis is that if you have coalition governments at the center, where then states have more power, institutions revive. This is obviously true of the 1980s and so on. So anyway, again, to shift gears and to come to another theme which kind of is not explicitly mentioned in your book, but reading your book, I had to ask, which is to do with the social role of the entrepreneur. Okay. Now, many astute thinkers, such as Milton Friedman, most famously, but others, would argue that the job of a capitalist is to augment productivity and profits within the ambit of the law. So don't be a crook, don't be a crony, don't be a chamcha, but focus on productivity and profits and making your shareholders happy and keeping your employees happy. That's your job. Your conception of an entrepreneur's role seems to be more expensive. That you think they must serve society, not just their shareholders. Some of what you say here and there in your book is not dissimilar to Gandhi's ideas on trusteeship, for example. Would that be fair?
Very much so. And it's both because I think that's the way in which you build a better society and a better country, and because of our special circumstances, it seems to be in India. So, one of the themes in the book is that we suffer as a country from limited state capacity. We can formulate policy, but we struggle to implement it at the end point, time and time again, and there are many, many examples, right? I mean, many examples from many and many examples in the book, right? If we have limited state capacity, who's going to step in and play those roles? That creates space, it seems to me, for private industry to play a much bigger role, and for NGOs to play a much bigger role. If you're Sweden, I think there's less space for NGOs to operate, and there's less space for private industry to play a social role. We're India, so I think private industry does have to play a role in helping improve school outcomes, in setting up centers like the Bangalore International Center, in coming together to inoculate populations, in providing ventilators for cities, as Bangalore did and Pune did. If the state fails, you have to step in and do whatever it takes to succeed as a society. And so that's our role, I think. And it's a good role.
Good. So I think we have time to just briefly talk about design. You say you have a whole chapter on design, and I urge people to read it. But again, this is linked to, in some ways, it follows on what you say and argue about R&D. You say that given India's size, we need at least 1,000 firms that are design champions. And there's maybe I'll quote what you say about design in the book. Again, so you say, given that design has so much potential to contribute to the success of our firms and to the lives of our people, what must we do to enable design to scale its impact? 4 things: size, the quality of design, raising the priority for design in industry, and thinking about design for public purpose, and fostering a sense of aesthetics across the country. I mean, it's beautifully and crisply put. I mean, that 4-fold criteria for enhancing design in industry. And later on in that chapter, you say, given our size, we need at least 1,000 firms that are design champions. And you deservedly single out Titan, for which we in Bangalore are grateful. But how do we get at least 100 such firms, or even a dozen?
We have a dozen.
Okay.
We have at least a dozen. Okay. Where we probably have 100 that are trying. Not there yet, but trying. But we need 1,000, right? So you have, the examples I give in the book, apart from Titan, are Royal Enfield and Bajaj Auto in motorcycles, Tata Motors and Mahindra in SUVs. And these are firms that compete with each other largely on design. And as a result, the Indian consumer gets better products. They get better products people compete and meet their needs in a better way. We need 1,000 firms that do that. Now, what would it take? It takes producing a lot more designers. It takes doing better quality design, and that's hard work. As Sujata will tell you, it's not brilliance. It's brilliance combined with a lot of hard work. It takes Indian industry valuing design and employing designers and giving them a real substantive voice in what the firm does and the service and product offerings it provides its customers. And then it takes a wider raising of our own aesthetic sensibility so that when we go out on the street and see a really ugly, horrible construction that's happening, we try to do something about it. If nothing else, then to hide it. So.
Okay, so I come finally to the domain of culture. Naushad, one of the first times we met, it may even have been the first time, we had dinner at your place, and your parents were there. Your wonderful parents were there, and there was a furious argument between your mother and your father about Jawaharlal Nehru. It was really great to see that argument. I kept shut, because I'd already written 1,000 pages on Nehru, so I was wanting to see what other people thought about Nehru. And if memory serves, your mother was critical and your father was supportive. Yeah. Now, obviously, you don't much care for Nehruvian economics. Fair enough. Nehru made some other grievous mistakes, for example, not focusing on primary education. But when I read your chapter on culture, with its title, Culture Building Unity in Diversity, right? Now, I don't know, maybe you don't mention Nehru in that chapter, perhaps, I'll have to check, right? But it's a vigorous defense.
I do actually.
It's a vigorous defense of pluralism,
yeah.
Of linguistic, religious, cultural pluralism. And this has an almost that chapter, whether or not it mentions Nehru, has a almost deliberately old-fashioned ring to it. In the India of 2022, when such a vigorous attempt is being made to flatten out this diversity and impose a unitary, homogenizing idea of what it means to be an Indian today. Right. In that chapter, I suppose in part because of the things you studied with Gordon Wright and others, you talk about how national cultures can change. You talk about how the Germany of Nazis and the theory of Lebensraum became the most welcoming country towards Syrian refugees. Now, I would add to that example a country I happen to know a little bit, which is Canada, which was absolutely racist, which practiced a white Canada policy and has gone in the matter of decades.
On New Zealand.
Canada is larger and has a much more complicated, because it has a much more complicated history of immigration, black immigration and so on, and Asian immigration. I mean, New Zealand doesn't really have. Yeah. So Canada is a much better example of a country that has gone from being all white to being truly, effortlessly, unself-consciously multicultural. Do you think we in India might be going the other direction, from being truly, effortlessly, unself-consciously multicultural to being this Hindu only, Hindi only, vegetarian only, etc. kind of place?
So clearly, that's part of the public discourse and the projection. Here's what my hope is. My hope is that is not truly intended, but it's meant to win votes. Because this is a way of appealing to a particular voting group and ensure that one gets elected or re-elected. So I think it's a more practical approach than perhaps an underlying belief. Second, I think that at the end of the day, diversity in India will triumph. It will triumph. Because you can't homogenize regions. I mean, look at the recent discussion in this last week on Hindi, right? And the pushback that came from the south of the country. And, that pushback would be familiar to Nehru. 60 years ago, right? And it's a pushback that's entirely healthy. And I think we should encourage it. So I think I actually have greater confidence in our diversity eventually winning through. And this attempt to, how do countries become homogenous? I mean, I'm not at all hoping that this is our future, by the way. The countries that take China. I think the reason China is as homogenous as it is today is because of the horrors that Mao unleashed on China with the Cultural Revolution. And it was, it was millions of deaths, decades of deprivation that churned and put that society through a common tortuous experience. I don't think we're anywhere near there.
Yeah, so we are certainly not near there, but I think there, as a historian, there are complicating factors which lead to one not being so optimistic. About Hindi, all right, there'll be a pushback on language. But on religion, we live in a neighborhood of majoritarian states. Yeah. Sri Lanka and Myanmar are Buddhist majoritarian states. Pakistan and Bhutan too. Pakistan and Bangladesh, Pakistan more than Bangladesh, are Islamic majoritarian states. And, in a sense, in many ways, we are, part of this. Fundamentalisms are rivalrous, competitive, they feed on each other. So I think, I also, by the way, don't think it's only about elections. I think it's about ideology. I mean, that's something, it's all about, there's a belief that this is a Hindu country and it belongs to us. And everyone who's not Hindu has to live here through our grace and our benediction, and in ways in which we want them to live. But anyway, that's maybe I'll be, maybe it's a passing phase, and I certainly would be, but I think and here leadership is crucial. I think the greatness of Nehru and Gandhi is to say, whatever Pakistan did to its minorities, here Muslims and Christians have equal rights. And I think that is the kind of question, and I don't necessarily think that it should come from our Prime Minister or Home Minister. It should come from our Hindu religious leaders. Gandhi never held a post. But as a Hindu, he was able to say things that carried far greater credibility and authority because he was not looking for votes. I mean, he was stating a moral point of view. So I think, again, this may be also partly, Naushad, because of, I'm a Hindu and you're not, So maybe you don't really know how many of my fellow Hindus really think, which is horrible and awful, by the way. Which is why I think it is Hindus have to speak out. This is a thing in which, I was reading a book. Maybe if you just give me a minute, I'll take out some quotes I took from a recent book, because they are actually very relevant to where we are today and to your chapter on culture. Just give me one.
So I'll mention, while you're looking for the quote, I'll mention that I do mention Nehru in the culture chapter.
Good. Okay.
And I mention him in the perspective of saying that, that look, when cultures change, that countries are lucky to have a particular leader at a particular point in time.
That's it. Yeah.
And the individuals that I pick up are, Mandela in South Africa.
Absolutely.
Merkel in Germany. Nehru in India. Yeah. Adenauer in Germany again.
Perfect. So let me just read out. I've been reading this wonderful book, which is written by a Japanese scholar, and it's a comparison of two of the greatest political theorists of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt and Isaiah Berlin. It's a dual biography, and two of the greatest political theorists, both Jewish. And of course, it's about their similarities, their differences, and so on, both of who saw Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, and wrote about both, right? Now, here are these two quotes I picked out as applying to my religion and my country. Hannah Arendt says, "Wrong done by my own people naturally grieves me more than wrong done by other people's." So when I'm told, what about what the Pakistanis are doing to the Hindus there? Wrong done by my own people naturally grieves me more than wrong done by other people. That's Hannah Arendt. And here is Isaiah Berlin from the same book. "Decent respect for others and the toleration of dissent are better than pride and a sense of national mission. You know, this could be an epigraph for the paperback edition of your wonderful book, because that's really what you're saying. Decent respect for others and the toleration of dissent are better than pride and a sense of national mission. You know, so I think that's the lesson of 20th century Europe, really. But, and not just Hitler's Germany, but Stalin's Russia and Mao's China as well.
You know, at some point...
And the general's Myanmar.
Absolutely. And I hope that at some point, there will be this realization that, you know, we have 200 million Muslims in India. And if we try to find ways in which we have 200 million more people who participate in our progress, we will be a lot stronger than if we try to isolate and keep down and suppress. So, I mean, it's, you know, if you're interested in India's progress,
you wouldn't be doing this.
I think you reach that conclusion.
Yeah, you wouldn't be doing it. Absolutely. So before we open up for questions, I had a few closing comments of my own, Naushad, if I may offer on this wonderful book. You know, this book is a twin conjoined product of heredity and environment, of the individual and his experiences and his learnings and the society he lives in. Your educational and personal background marks it. One of the most appealing features of the book is the self-deprecatory humor, which comes naturally only to Parsis among all Indian communities. Only Parsis can laugh at themselves and their society as a community. Hindus may occasionally as individuals. One of them is R.K. Lakshman, whose cartoons pepper your book and make it so much more enjoyable and pleasurable. So I think heredity and environment, I think your background, your family background, your religious background, your education environment, your education in Stanford, and the fact that you are based in Pune may not be accidental. This is the view from Pune rather than that from Bombay, Bangalore, or Delhi. And I think the view from Pune is in the India of today, less self-confident, self-righteous, self-pompous than either the view from Delhi, written by a government chap, or from Bangalore, which is full of self-congratulations about its entrepreneurs. You know. So I think this is the view from Pune, from the city of Jyotiba and Savitri Phule, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and Rahul Bajaj. So I think that's part of what makes this book so special. Finally, since we are speaking in the Bangalore International Center, while reading your book, Naushad, at many points of time, I was comparing it to Nandan Nilekani's Imagining India, which was published in 2008. There's similarities, you know, in the range and intellectual ambition. It's the only other book by an Indian entrepreneur that is so wide-ranging, thoughtful, talks about all kinds of other things than his own domain expertise. There are differences. One difference is that in some of the themes you highlight, like design and innovation and culture, don't feature in Nandan's book. Some of the themes that Nandan highlights, like demography and ecology, don't really feature in your book. But these are the two really high-quality books by Indian entrepreneurs, I think, that have emerged probably ever, you know, certainly in the last 20 or 30 years. But there's a difference. And the difference is crucial. And it's about context. Nandan was writing in 2007, 2008, at a time when, as Ravi suggested in his introductory remarks, India seemed inexorably on the rise when there was talk of an Asian century. You know, historians are professionally skeptics, perhaps even cynics. So even then, I was mocking our pretensions to being a superpower. I wrote a pamphlet in 2008, which carried the title, 10 Reasons Why India Will Not and Should Not Be a Superpower. I met Nandan shortly afterwards, and he said, you're too pessimistic. Right. Now, most like Nandan thought that the world was ours to claim. Now, 15 years later, the air of optimism has dissipated. I think even while you were writing the book, the title changed several times, as I recall from our discussions. And you talk, therefore, the struggle and the promise, right? The struggle before the promise. At the subtitle, you talk of restoring India's potential. So, Naushad, yours is a reality check, but a brilliant, reflective, analytical, necessary reality check. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, we have time for, I think, at least 15 minutes of questions. So, who'd like to come up and ask? You can just come up. Whoever wants to ask questions can just come up. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for this discussion. It's my birthday, and I couldn't have spent the evening better. Thank you so much. I'm part of a leadership team of an organization where we work with girls from marginalized communities to help them enter into the tech industry. Now, in your discussion, you've talked about both manufacturing and tourism as the promise. How do you see access to digital skills and digital industry for people who currently may not necessarily have it, but we are starting to see that they are able to kind of like get 20x through a kind of like some kind of intervention. So what is your sense on those numbers? Right now, we definitely have more demand than students who we can supply to it, but over a period of time, how do you see? And secondly, when you talked about the modernization versus the debate, in our campuses, we literally kind of like grapple with this, and this is a decision that we need to make, right? Because we have a girl from rural Telangana who's grown up on a farm, and then we are asking her to understand how calendars work and kind of work by it. And there is that kind of conflict that we as a team face. So any thoughts on that?
Sure.
Please, go ahead.
So, first on the digitalization question, I think we should ask Chris, because he would have a much better answer than I would.
It would be nice to have you as an outsider's perspective.
Okay, so
I mean, you've talked enough about manufacturing. So now talk about this.
So the only comment I'd make is, I think the thing that we can really always benefit from is greater investments in quality education. So how do you actually create that access where people can actually participate in the modern economy by giving them the tools that enable them to? And now teaching people such that they are comfortable with digital tools is an essential part of that. So how do you do it? Can you do it post-education? Can you make up for lapses in the education system by using technology? My understanding is that there are an increasing number of actually social ventures that are trying to do just that are trying to actually use digital technology as a way of making up for at the end of the day, not trying to build on, but make up for lapses in our school education system. I mean, more power to you. I don't know how effectively it can make up, fundamentally for what should be years of good quality base education and schooling. But, the more one can, I mean, I'm sure it can help greatly, but can it do it fully? I don't know. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Your second question will come to later. Happy birthday.
Thank you very much, Dr. Forbes and Dr. Guha, for a very stimulating and scintillating conversation. It was great to be someone, near the fireside listening to you. The question is directed towards you, Dr. Forbes, trying to tie in some of the things that you started with in terms of manufacturing and going into design. And the part that I've been thinking about is that, when I was growing up, my mother used to point out when first the Japanese transistors came out, that in the 1930s and 40s, the Japanese were not known for quality products. And yet if you think about it, the space from the time when Japan modernized to 1930 or 40 is about the time that we've had an independence. And the question then comes is that now today we talk about Japan and quality. And one part of the quality of Japan has been its whole belief of serving the entire world with a quality product. In India, there has been a belief, starting from Nehru and others, that we have a large enough domestic market and the rest of the world doesn't matter. Yet, if you manufacture for the world, as you say, you will get your checks and balances in place. You will have to control your costs because the Vietnamese may be better than you. So the question which I'm sort of coming towards and trying to tie all of this together is, if we actually changed our focus to becoming not Atmanirbhar, but basically the producer, the generator of designs and all for the world, to have to serve the world and not just India, would we not be in a better place and try and think about our policies to get to the kind of things that you're talking about with manufacturing and tourism jobs? Thank you very much. I look forward to your answer.
Absolutely agree. And actually, chapter 4 in the book is basically an argument to do just that. And it starts, as Ram referred to, with my brother Farhad and I hearing Manmohan Singh's 1991 budget speech, which heralded an opening up of the economy, and being so affected by it that we then went back and said that we would do two things as a company. We would change what we did in R&D from indigenization to developing products for the world. So only if we did products, anything that we did in R&D had to be something we could sell internationally. And second, we set up an international operations or an export department to start trying to sell in the world, because we said, let's go on the basis that all products can come in and compete with us at zero duty. So at zero duty, what would we actually continue to make? And we realized that we would probably make only half of what we then made. And so we said, let's develop more products that we can sell everywhere, and let's start exporting, because the best way of being able to compete with foreign firms in India is if we can first compete with them overseas. So let's learn, and let's use exports as a way of forcing learning for us as a company. So I fully subscribe to that belief. And actually, I think the potential for Indian industry to actually operate around the world is huge. There are opportunities everywhere. We are a large economy, but we should remind ourselves that the ASEAN economy, the 10 countries that make up ASEAN, is equal to the Indian economy in size. So we can double our market by using our ASEAN FTA. We can, the Japanese economy is twice India's size, so that much more. The Korean economy is 2/3 India's size. The Australian economy is half India's size. By just really approaching Asia, we have the potential, without even getting into China, which is 6 times our size, we can really approach a market that is multiples of what we currently have if we focus only internally.
If I may just add a footnote to you, to what Naushad said, because your question is a very important and perceptive one. It also applies to culture. We now want to promote a certain kind of Hindu culture, Atmanirbhar culture. And if you look at our soft power, where we scored over China, our musicians, our dancers, our artists, our writers, our craftspeople, and none of their culture, none of what they did would subscribe to a orthodox party line culture, right? So even the way, actually, the closing of the Indian mind also will impact the closing of the Indian economy and have, they kind of mutually reinforce each other. So I think that's, under Nehru, we had one, but we didn't have the other,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
In some ways, and I think that, so I just want to, Prem.
The roots of modernity a few centuries ago, when it displaced feudalism, lay in the core argument that everyone has the capacity to reason, therefore everyone should be equal. More recently, the German philosopher Habermas said that modernity is an unfinished project. And one of the key reasons why it has remained unfinished is that it shifted from being an ethical project to an aesthetic project. And our perceptions of modernity rest on aesthetic symbols like the metropolis with high-rise towers, the modern factory, the well-constructed highway. And we've lost those ethical foundations of recognition. So we have cities, for example, are paradigms of planning that where 50 to 60% of the population are forced to exist outside master planning. So given that, isn't it dangerous to go down a path, for example, like you argued on labor laws, saying that perhaps we need less than ideal labor laws because we need to create jobs? Doesn't that face the dangers of pushing modernity in this aesthetic direction, in entrenching certain class divides and vested interests, and more importantly, losing the ethical foundations of modernity, which will make it harder and harder to recover?
No, I think your fear is very well placed. I think you constantly have to work at these things. You'll never get it completely right. Yeah. So I'm not arguing for scrapping labor laws. I'm saying we need to enhance the flexibility of employment in the country and the ability to employ many more people. And probably if we have some years of employing lots of people in the country, maybe in conditions that are not ideal, then you start saying, okay, now how do we improve standards? And you keep moving up and improving things, but you're starting at a level which is better than what we have now. So I think it's, it's the politics is the art of the possible thing. You improve as much as you possibly can, and you keep saying, okay, how can I do better? How can I do better? How can I ensure a greater sense of whether it's safety or livelihood or earnings or whatever in the environment in which we are. So I think you keep trying to do that. Now, on the urbanization piece, there is this, I think, somewhat romantic notion that rural life is superior. I think it's not. I mean, I would make the argument that given the choice, people migrate from rural areas to urban areas because they're searching for employment and because they're searching for better lives for themselves and their families. And so we need to address that aspiration by enabling them to move to cities in safe and welcoming and clean circumstances. So, we should be addressing FSI regulations so that we can have much denser cities and bring together many more people in compact areas. We should be setting in place good infrastructure so that we can move people from satellite cities cheaply and quickly into the center of towns. But we should see urbanization as a good, because it's actually the way in which you can end up with many more millions of people who are productively employed. I know that's not what you were arguing against at all, but I just want to say that urbanization, I think, is actually part of the development and modernization process.
I think
even if some of it is brutal.
I mean, I think it is unresolved debate between Ambedkar, who would argue that, famously said that the village is a den of inequity.
Yeah.
And environmentalists who would say, urban life at this scale is just not sustainable in the planet.
But,
so
for example, there was this wonderful paper some years ago that looked at, for the US, that looked by district at energy consumption per citizen. The least efficient was rural Texas, right? Because people live far from each other in large houses that they cooled, and then they drove long distances. The most efficient was Manhattan, right? Manhattan, right? Supposedly because of this hedonistic lifestyle, but right, people lived in apartments, much more efficient in terms of heating and cooling than independent homes. They used public transport because they were all concentrated together. So they didn't drive long distances. So, from an ecology point of view, actually rural Texas is worse than Manhattan.
But that won't be true of India. So, it won't be true of Bangalore versus Kolar, for example. Yeah. Ravi, we could go on 5-10 minutes extra? Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
That's not true of India because of poverty in rural areas.
Hi, I'm sorry, I stumbled into this lecture, but I can't help but wonder. There was a lecture that I listened a couple of years ago about from Anand Giridharadas, the guy who wrote Winners Take All. I know our public institutions are under threat by autocratic leaders, but what he argues is, how do you get these? We want to lock away. We want to give social and societal changes to CEOs who are going to make. With relaxed labor laws, they are the ones who are making the profit, making the inequality worse. And you give, for example, Bill Gates, who is a wonderful person, but his forte is not education, but he's dictating poverty and how educational system changes. How do we get people who have that much power and that much money out of systems that we don't want to change? At least authoritarian leaders, at some point, we can vote them out. What you're advocating for, giving the private sector more and more liberty to change societal laws, and educational reform, how do we get those people out if it falls in the wrong hands?
So I know the Anand Giridhar's book. I think he has a point, which could have been made in 5 pages instead of 300. But it's okay. He has a point, and I think the only way is, I'm not suggesting that industrialists should have the power to determine outcomes for individual citizens. I'm saying that that industry has a bigger role to play in a society like India because of lapses in state capacity. And we should step up and fill in some of those gaps that exist around us. Now, does that then give us rights over what people should do? No, it doesn't. Does it mean that the choices that we make will be greater and will influence others? Yes, maybe so. So, for example, if you have, let's say, someone who funds an institution like this, right? So probably you have a donor who determines the color of the chairs, or the architect who builds the building, which then is part of the environment that we're all subject to. But aren't we better off as a society for having the center? It seems to me we are, and because otherwise, what's the alternative?
I mean, this is a complex and difficult question which requires full, but essentially, civil society has to be a check on the excesses of the state and of industrialists.
So NGOs, that's one of the role of NGOs, absolutely.
That is, so I think that's where really, I mean, like Sweden would be an example, or some European countries. But, as Gandhi, again, Gandhi famously warned, I mean, giving more and more powers to the state is usually problematic. But anyway, there are a couple more questions. Yeah.
I think the role that NGOs can play actually as agents of accountability is very important.
Civil society has to hold industrialists and the state to account. It's not, and I think that's something one should work. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is more towards the trusteeship angle that we were talking about. Yeah. For me, when I think of the promise of India, it's more about how do we direct talent that we're generating towards becoming social entrepreneurs, right? From an institutional perspective. So what I want to understand from both of you is, do you think it's more of enabling people to go on these internal journeys towards self-actualization? Like this person called Ravi Kailas who writes this book called Myth of the Entrepreneur. Is it more like meditation and vipassana and you figure that from within, become strong? Or is it using existing institutions like religion, like family, like the partners that you live with? Should that sort of come in, and is that where are we going to create people who are like, I'm going to do it for society, right? Like, so I'm trying to understand in this, because I'm coming from trying to understand, I understand people of my age, I understand today's kids of 2022. I'm trying to see that how do they enter this world, right? Do they need coercion from family and love and religious leaders? Or do they need to go inside, and do schools need to enable that sort of a journey? Because the economy is not enabling self-actualization, because no one cares if you're going to become more helpful for yourself and, in that journey. But there's that transition and that building of that character happening, right? So for me, that's where the promise lies. I don't know who needs to incentivize what. So that's why I'm looking for some clarity. Thank you.
You want to go? You go for.
That's a wonderful question. We are both much older than you. I think
three times the age.
I think we are probably not best placed to answer it, because we grew up in an India where the urge to contribute came from the example of people like Gandhi and Nehru. People you can't mention today, because today the idea is to diminish Gandhi and extinguish Nehru, All right. And so it did come from religion. It didn't come from religion. It may have come from family, in Naushad's case from his parents, in my case from my parents. It could have come from there. What kind of religious leader could provide it? I say, it's hard to say. I mean, if you look at the religious leaders around you, it's including in this city, the so-called custodians of Hinduism. And that will probably be true of the custodians of Islam and Christianity and so on too. So I don't know. I mean, but obviously, you don't have Gandhi and Nehru.
Not at all.
You either go to Narendra Modi or Rahul Gandhi, who are both far short of Gandhi and Nehru in very different respects. Right. So if you follow that path, then you become then it becomes bhakti. And Gandhi and Nehru taught you actually to think for yourself. They didn't say, follow me blindly. Right. They said, this is what creates a just, a noble, a caring society. The idea of trusteeship comes from Gandhi. I think Gandhi is, when it comes to what Naushad is doing, or the subject of today, which is what entrepreneurs can contribute, Gandhi is much more relevant, whereas Nehru regrettably had a kind of a Brahminical stroke Fabian scorn for entrepreneurs, and which deeply damaged us. He had many other extraordinary qualities. I mean, one reason we are together is we are still a country is really because of Nehru, but that he didn't understand. What can social entrepreneurs contribute or non-social entrepreneurs? I think Gandhi had some sense. But, so, I mean, I have a child who's your age, who's a social entrepreneur, and she's actually passionate, and she may have got, I don't know where she is. I'll have to ask her where she gets it from,
Right,
So,
right.
But I think we had, our generation, I think, got it from the freedom struggle and what it represented. Because there was still that legacy in our parents. It was still there.
Like the reason I'm asking is I have a friend who wants to do this promise and struggle, and he's a fighter pilot and he's sitting right there, right?
Yeah.
So lots of people are looking for ways. How do we create more Vinoba Bhaves in 2022, right? And so where's the spark? Where?
No, it's great that all of you are here. I mean, you'll find it's wonderful that there's a fighter pilot and there's you, and it's fantastic. It shows that actually Naushad is probably right to be more optimistic than me. That's what it probably shows. So
it is actually, So I'll make first. I fully agree with what you just said. Almost as a joke, but I think I fully agree with that. I think actually there's huge keenness to contribute and participate and do whatever one can to improve, whether it's our cities or whether it's our community or whether it's the country. Yeah. So I think that's there and it's widespread. Right. Yeah. I'll just make one comment, which is, we were talking earlier in the day about a really wonderful column that Pratap Bhanu Mehta wrote on liberalism in yesterday's Indian Express. It was on Putinism, the danger of Putinism, but it was actually about liberalism. One of the essential attributes of liberalism is a focus on the individual and individual self-actualization. Because if you talk about self-actualization, you come back to the individual. And I think really finding ways in which each individual can contribute and participate and find meaning for themselves, not from others, for themselves. So keep working at it because you have to find it for yourself, right? You can be inspired by the example of many others, but at the end of the day, you have to find your own answer, I think. And I think liberalism is at the heart. That's the message. It's find your own path, and the reason education matters is because it enables you to find your own path.
The reason I'm trying to attach an economic model to that.
Last two, thank you, a wonderful question. Last two questions, I think, and Arvind, you're next.
Yes, hello. I've just started reading the book, but this is a quote from the excerpt on the HarperCollins website. So I'd like you to comment on it.
Hopefully they got it right.
Yes. When some of our present-day nationalists talk of reclaiming some bygone golden age of Indian history, they are mistaken. There was glory if you were the ruler or near him, almost always him and not her. For an ordinary person in every country, life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. If you could comment on that.
Well, that's a quote from Hobbes' Leviathan, but it's just a reflection on how the world has been, right? I mean, if you go back 500 years, which is what we like to go back to, and we say that was, a glorious time in our history, right? Well, was it? How many people at that time could read and write? What was the proportion of the population that did? What was the proportion of the population then that had basic rights? What was the proportion of the population that got an education? What was the proportion that participated in broader economic activity, institutional activity, economic, political activity of any kind? Very, very tiny numbers. It's really the last 500 years that have seen the world progress. And the reason we accounted for a higher share of GDP, as I say in the book, a higher share of GDP in 1500 than we do now, is because all of the world was poor and we had more poor people than anyone else. So that just gave us a higher share of world GDP. Then some countries started getting rich and moving ahead. It's for us to join that group and to catch up as fast as we can.
Just add a footnote to that. If you go back 500 years ago, or even 200 or 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 years ago in our country, all the historical evidence tells you that women were second class, Shudras were third class, Dalits were fourth class. That's 80% of the population at least, who lived subhuman lives in terms of individual freedoms. So, I mean, these are just objective facts, yeah. Arvind, last question.
Thanks to Naushad and Ram for the really, I think, a wonderful conversation. The sense one really gets is that you're putting forward some sense of a larger vision of what industry should be or what industry should aspire towards being. And I think that's very important because I think what I detected in Ram's comments is a certain sense of concern on the way things are going in the country and definitely in the state of Karnataka. And why industry matters so much is if we saw the recent attacks on Muslims vending outside temples in this city or in this state, and civil society was up in arms saying this is unacceptable, etc., etc. Chief Minister didn't care. One tweet by Kiran Mazumdar, and suddenly you saw a certain kind of a tempering which happened. Then we realized the power which industry in that sense wields. But the tragic part, of course, is they're not speaking up in a larger way, and they should. I mean, as you rightly indicated, if you don't have this sense of basic question of peace, you're imperiling the progress of this country. But that larger vision is something which is tragically absent and which is very difficult to get people to speak up. So if you have any thoughts on how you'd get industry to speak up.
So, there's a lot in the book on the importance of 4 I's for industry and, of inclusion, of being international, of being innovative. And the 4th I is independent, right? And an independent private sector, it seems to me, is an inherent part of an India that will head great in a quicker way towards the promise that we have. And that independence needs to show in various ways. So it needs to show an industry speaking up on things that concern it, right? And individual industrialists speaking up as citizens in the country. Now, I'm not a social activist. I wouldn't know social I'd probably starve if I tried to be a social, in fact, I definitely would starve if I tried to be a social activist. I'm no social activist, right? But I believe that as a citizen of India, I have every right to express my opinion on things that I see, and I have every right to say that these are things that I like and enjoy and approve of, and these are things I don't. Now, as a citizen, I shouldn't necessarily be taken any more seriously than any other citizen. So in that sense, I wish in that sense, Kiran's tweet was not given the prominence it did, because I would really love it if there were 1,000 industrialists who said the same thing, and 1,000 other people who also said the same thing, because that's what would make a change and really act as a check on things. Yeah. But I think as a society, we're better off for her tweet.
Thank you, and thank you, Naushad, for this wonderful evening. Thank you to BIC, as always. And the book is on sale outside, so please buy it and get your copy signed. This is a terrific book. It's been a great privilege to have been part of this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.